Good morning friends. Today in this video I am planning to explain the economic effects of Russia and Ukraine war, how it will affect the global economy. Here I am planning to discuss about some of the areas like commodity shocks, global financial system and global inflation rate, global economic growth rates and impacts on trading blocks and what are the human costs created by the Russia and Ukraine crisis. As we all know that we are just recovering from the pandemic situation. The global economy is now face a upward trend slightly. In this situation, this crisis will pull back the global economic performances completely. We all know that yesterday, last Thursday, the oil prices went to $100 per barrel and natural gas prices is just high to increase by 62%. This all things shows that an economy is having a severe impact because of Russia and Ukraine crisis. Firstly, in the case of commodity shocks, here we are going to see what are the commodities produced in the Russia. You can see that it is in 2001 data. According to that, aluminum, copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, steel, gold, diamond, fertilizers, wheat, oil and natural gas. These are the basic productions of Russia. In the case of Ukraine, we can see that 25 top exports of Ukraine, especially sunflower products, corn, IT services, wheat, iron ore, wood, junk cables, soya, etc. You can see that these are the basic export of these two countries. Why I am saying these things here? Why? Because you have to get a clear idea about how these commodities supply will be influenced because of Russia-Ukraine crisis. So, especially in the case of commodity shocks, Russia and Ukraine could disrupt the oil supplies in the region, which would be leads to a high gas and oil prices and other commodity prices like agriculture products. Then the supply of these commodities could be damaged in one of two ways. Their delivery might be disrupted if the physical infrastructure such as pipelines and Black Sea ports were destroyed due to the war and everything. It will be destroyed means the transportation of goods and services will be very difficult and that will create some supply shocks. Then Western restrictions on economic sanctions on Russia's natural resource industry that will create a huge impact on the global supply. As we know that exporters fear that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine could be disrupt the oil supplies in the region, which would be leads to increased oil prices. Russia is the second largest oil producer in the world, behind the US. In the case of metal, Russia and Ukraine leads to a global production of metal such as nickel, copper and iron. They are also largely involved in the export and manufacture of other essential raw materials like neon, palladium, platinum, etc. So these commodity shocks, as well as being a dominant supplier of gas to Europe, Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers and key supplier of industrial metals such as nickel, aluminum and palladium. Both Russia and Ukraine are the major wheat exporters even. While Russia have a rich potash which would be using into the fertilizers and everything. So the prices of these commodities have been rising this year and are now likely to be rise further. So why? Because of that, because any commodity supply will be reduced because of this Russia-Ukraine crisis. These commodities supply will be affected. Once the commodity supply is reduced, of course, what will happen to the price? It will increase. So these are the basically commodity shocks we can able to experience, we can able to expect it will happen in because of Russia and Ukraine crisis. Secondly, I am going to explain about how Russia-Ukraine crisis will affect the global financial system. The White House revealed the measures to isolate Russia from global financial and tech trade system. Think of sanctioning as a financial restrictions imposed on Russia and agents operating out of Russia. European Union and US are likely to impose heavy restrictions on Russia's ability to borrow from the investors in Europe. America is thus likely to put a much harder Hawaii-style sanctions on Russia's tech firms, limiting their access to cut-edge semiconductors and software, and also blacklist Russia's largest two banks, Superbank and VTB. So because of these things, what is going to be happen is that it will adversely affect the global financial system. The United States said that the imposing severe economic sanctions on Russia in response to the President Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine, aimed at paralyzing the Russian economy and its financial institutions and its access to the technology. Without borrowed money, it can become extremely harder to Russia to wage a prolonged military campaigns. The US will also impose a similar sanctions and ban key Russian businessmen from their country, and they will freeze their assets and target businesses in Russia, making it harder to them to operate across the world. But here is something interesting. These measures won't just hurt Russia. This will also have some collateral damage back to US even and European Union. Take for example, the sanctions imposed on Russell, that is Russia's aluminium gain back in 2018. After a few months, US had rolled back the sanction because unexpected fraud in the aluminum market. So how this all will affect the global economy? Russia faces a serious but not fatal economic shocks as its financial system is isolated. For the global economy, the prospect of higher inflation and the prices of natural resources like oil and agricultural commodity intensifying the dilemma that central bank faces, and a possible mounting of corporate investment and fluctuating the market reduces the confidence. Business confidence it will affect. Through that one, it will affect the global financial system like foreign direct investment. Maybe previously there was an upward trend of increasing foreign direct investment in the countries like Russia, but now we can able to see that investment flow will change. So like these kind of changes will affect the foreign direct investment and the business confidence among the investors, and that we can able to see the fluctuations in the stock prices and everything. Thirdly, I am going to explain how this conflict will affect the global inflation rate. A sudden rise in oil prices could affect the multiple industries. Prices could soar and inflation could become a key concern, not just in Russia or US or European Union, but everywhere. Right now, Germany has decided to stop the final approval to operate Nord Stream 2. Rising oil prices in the West would accelerate already rising inflation levels by producing a record prices at the pump and driving chemical prices to the new high. Turkey, a big energy importer, which has already had a dropped the currency and saw inflation before Ukraine crisis, is an extreme example. So here we know about the Nord Stream 2, a 1,200-kilometer pipeline running under the Baltic Sea, transporting natural gas from Russia to Germany. The pipeline is ready. All they need is that go ahead a final seal of approval to transport natural gas from Russia to European Union. However, within the sanction in place, that may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, Europe will have to source the gas from elsewhere, which will likely to lift the prices for everyone because global demand for natural gas will increase and at the same time supply is being reduced. The sanctioning Russian gas would hit the Russia's ability to export outside of Europe. However, it would come to very heavy prices for energy consumers globally, like heating bills, electricity bill, fertilizer prices, associated food cost would all reach the record levels because of this oil price hike. We know that oil is a basic raw material needed for the production of all goods and services. So whenever we are calculating inflation in a weighted price index, we will give a very high weightage on oil prices. So a small rise in oil prices will create a greater impact on inflation rates. So here we can understand that because of this crisis, it is going to be increase the global inflation rate altogether. Next, I am going to explain about the global economic growth rate and the impact of Russia-Ukraine crisis. The household spending an ever large amount of their income on fuel and heating will have less cash for other goods and services. That will create a fall in the business confidence and making it harder for the firms to tap fund for the investment. We know that because of the low consumption, for example, because of increasing high prices of the commodities, they will not feel there will be wealth effect, a fall in the wealth of the people because the asset price is reduced, and fall in the consumption expenditure may lead to fall in the profitability of the businesses. That will reduces the business confidence, that will reduces the investment. So consumption and investment are the major components of aggregate demand, and aggregate demand will fall. Some like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf oil exporters might get benefited, but for most emerging markets already suffering slower recoveries, the combination of higher prices and capital outflow could deliver a major blow and exacerbate the risk of post-COVID debt crisis. So because of we are coming out of the COVID crisis, so that already we are facing so many difficulties regarding low investment, low consumption and everything. Along with that, high oil prices will reduces the economic growth of most of the emerging economies like India, China, Russia, USA and European Union countries will result a fall in global economic growth. Just how a big blow the conflict ends up and delivering to the global economy will depend upon its length and scope and sovereignty of Western sanctions and the possibility that the Russia might be retaliate. There is a potential for the other twist too, from an exodus Ukraine refugees to the wave of Russian cyber attacks. So everything will have an impact on the global economic growth. For example, I just said about how magnitude of this war, how many time it will last, and how the sanctions imposed on the Russia will have impact on the global trade, and how the potential for the Ukraine refugees, for example, because of the war and other, there will be migration of people from Ukraine to the outside the country or Russia to outside. So how all these factors will contribute finally will end up a lower economic growth, a global lower economic growth because of the high oil prices and because of the shortage of oil supply and because of fall in the business and consumer confidences and everything. Next, I'm going to explain about how this Russian-Ukraine crisis will impact on the trading bloc and globalization. We all know that the long-term impact will be to accelerate the division of the world into economic blocs. Russia will be forced tilt east, relying more on trade and financial links with China. In the West, more politicians and firms will ask if the key tenets of globalization, that you should trade with everyone, not just your geopolitical alliances, is still valid, not just for Russia but other autocracies. China will look at the Western sanctions and Russia and conclude that it needs to be intensify its campaign of self-sufficiency. The invasion of Ukraine may not cause a global economic crisis today, but it will change how the world economy operates for the decades to come. So we already know that the trading blocs, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the SAARC, the G20 countries. So now after this crisis, we can experience the emergence of new trading blocs, and that will make this entire world into two divisions. In last but not for the least, the impact of Russian and Ukraine crisis and human cost. It should be evident by now that this crisis, it is not just about geopolitics. It is about economies, money and shared financial interest. But like most things, economics is a fleeting enterprise. You make some money today, you lose some tomorrow. But the human cost will be immeasurable. You can't just look at past, at the bloodshed and the misery this war will become if Russia chooses to invade Ukraine and subjugate its people, people who, by the way, have no role to play in any of this. So what I'm trying to say is that human capital is the most important factor. Because of this crisis, it will result a huge loss of human capital, and it will be result in issues like refugees, migration, and population impacts. And if they are using any atomic weapons, it will have a very huge impact for the future generation even. So before I am finishing, just think, and we all will hope for the best. Thank you.